So, hello everybody, hello from Jerusalem, and indeed we're having quite a half a year really since this government took power in January. And in these four meetings, I would like to shed a spotlight on different areas in Israel right now, in Israeli politics and society right now. And for the first meeting we have today, I want to really zoom out and take a big look about what happened to Israeli or Jewish identity over the last 30 years. I would like to suggest that something dramatic shifted in the way Jews perceive themselves in Israel over the last 3 decades, and that to try to explain how that happened and what exactly it means. And towards the end of my little presentation, I would like to connect all of this to the struggle happening right now in Israel, to the judicial overhaul, and to the two sides that are really, you might say, battling for the future of Israeli democracy, each from their own point of view. And so that's what I want to do, and I will jump right in. As we say, I will just share my presentation that I've prepared. Right, this is what we're talking about. Privatization of religion and the rise of ethno-nationalism, trends and fluctuations in Israeli Jewish identity. Okay, so let's do that. Just let me switch this here. Okay, and I'll begin with this. This basically is the classic fourfold division of Israeli Jewish society. And remember, all through this talk, I will be talking only of Jewish society in Israel. That's about 80% of Israelis. Obviously, we have another 20% of Arabs and different groups within. Also, that's not what I will not address them at all. This is the Jewish Israeli society. And this is from the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics, the governmental office that does statistics for the government in Israel. And we have the four groups: the secular, basically the descendants of the founders of the state, the secular, socialist, Zionist movement that came to Israel at the beginning of the 20th century, that established a stronghold here, and at 48 became independent after the British mandate was over, right? And we've got then, and these are about 46%, at least according to the 2014 survey. We've got 36% of traditional Jews. These are mostly Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries. So Arab countries, Turkey, Iran, etc., that are considered and more traditional. They did not go through the enlightenment and secularization process of European Jews that European Jews went through, and so they present a slightly different Jewish identity. We've got then about 11% religious Zionists. These are Orthodox Jews who, at the end of the 19th century, became Zionists, joined the Zionist movement that Herzl was leading, and wanted to collaborate and wanted to have both things, both a national home for the Jewish people and to be observant, religiously observant Jews. Okay, so that's the religious Zionists. And then we've got, of course, the Ultra-Orthodox, 9% approximately. Ultra-Orthodox are the Haredi Jews who were not Zionists and are still not Zionists, and are more secluded, rejecting modern values in general and keeping to their own, as you, of course, know also from the States, more or less. Now, what I would like to suggest to you about this pie chart here is that you can get almost no relevant information about the Israeli society from it. It is too abstract. It is divided in a very coarse way. And the fact that the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics still uses it is a flaw on their side. It's just almost irrelevant today as a way to understand Israeli society. A much better way to understand it, or at least a step forward, is what we have from the 2017 survey of the Jewish People Policy Institute, a private institute in Jerusalem that works. And as you can see here, the division is much more detailed, much more diverse, right? And indeed, there are much more groups, many more Jewish identities in Israel today than the former pie chart suggested. So we have totally secular Jews, we have secular, a bit traditional, we have traditional, we have religious liberal, this is religious Zionist liberal, we have religious Zionist mainstream, we have the Chardal, which are Haredi religious Zionists. Okay, these are religious Zionists who are Zionists, they are nationalists, they serve in the army, etc., but they have adopted the ultra-Orthodox Haredi way of understanding the world, as in rejecting most of modern values, modern humanism, feminism, liberalism, etc. And we've got the ultra-Orthodox also. So something has happened in the Israeli society. And when the Central Bureau of Statistics uses the right side pie chart, it does so, I would say, because of inertia, because it once was relevant. Once at the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel, and in its first few decades, of course, this was true. These were very robust groups. The borders between them were strong. You did not have many switchers overs. You did not have many people with one foot on one group, one foot in the other. This was the reality. But it's no longer that way. And Israeli society is much closer to the leftward pie chart. And indeed, not only that, this is a survey from 2013, and this is the first time that Israelis were asked, what is your denomination? Okay? In Hebrew, zerem dati ata shayach. What is your denomination? Now, we don't have denominations in Israel, right? Denomination is a European American thing, certainly for Jews. And we almost don't have, Reform and conservative Jews never were not established in Israel at the beginning of its existence. And so we don't really have it. And accordingly, 56% of Jews asked that question said, well, we are of no denomination. And the Orthodox said, yeah, we're Orthodox, because they know that they are Orthodox, right? But the great surprise in this survey was that we have over 7% of Jewish Israelis who say that they are either Reform or conservative Jews. That's a few hundred of thousands of Jews in Israel identifying as Reform and conservative Jews. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they go to a conservative or Reform shul, because they don't. Because we have 150 communities of Reform and conservative Jews in Israel. That's a few thousand people. Let's say 20,000 people. It's not 300,000-400,000 people, which are 7% or even more, which are 7% of the Jewish population in Israel. So these are Jews who identify that way, but don't actually do anything about it. But it's still, of course, very significant. It means that something has changed in the Jewish identity in Israel. So I've added these to the pie chart on the right. We have also these people who are somewhere there, and maybe in the Jewish People Policy Institute survey, they are considered secular, a bit traditional. Maybe they're considered secular. I don't know how they counted them, right? But they're there somewhere. We've also got people who are anti-religious. We need to identify that. We've got about 5% of Jews in Israel that in different surveys not only say that they are secular, i.e. non-observant, maybe non-believers, but they are anti-religious. They think religion is a threat, Jewish religion, and they are actively protesting, sometimes struggling against That's not all. We've got the Ultra-Orthodox. If we zoom in into the Ultra-Orthodox, we see that they are comprised of different groups themselves. We've got about 40% Lithuanians or Mithnagdim Jews. These are the Ultra-Orthodox that lay a lot of emphasis on Torah study, on Talmud study, Gemara study, right? And they are about 40% of the Haredi population in Israel. We've got about 34% Hasidic Jews, descendants of Hasidic courts and communities, which lay less emphasis on Torah study and more on different observances that come from the Kabbalah, a bit of spirituality sometimes, though far from the spirit of Hasidism when it was in its inception in the 18th century, but still more than the Lithuanians. And then we also have the Sephardim, the Mizrahi or traditional Jews who became ultra-Orthodox. And so these are Jews, again, coming from Islamic countries, Arab countries, Iran, etc. And in Israel, becoming ultra-Orthodox, there was no ultra-Orthodoxy in Islamic countries. Ultra-Orthodoxy itself is a reaction towards the Enlightenment and secularization processes. So these people became ultra-Orthodox in Israel, and they present a certain type of ultra-Orthodoxy that is not Lithuanian and not Hasidic. And then we've got others. The others here are all sorts of new Haredi. They are Haredim that are more integrated into the general Israeli populace. They exhibit more modern characteristics, and they don't fit in the different groups that you see here. So if we go back to the pie chart, we need to add them too, and you see I've added them in the upper right corner. New Haredi, right? They're also there somewhere, right? Inside Ultra-Orthodoxy. They're also part of the new divergent identities of Jews in Israel. And that's not all. We also have, I would say, about either 5 to 30% of New Age Jews. Now, here the numbers can vary very largely because it really depends how you count them. I mean, 30% of Jews definitely use alternative medicine or holistic medicine, which is today offered even by the governmentally funded Kupot Cholim, our social security and healthcare that we have for everybody governmentally paid. So if that's New Age, a lot of Jews are that. And if we are talking about more spiritually focused, practiced people, we've got at least 5% of those who do yoga, meditation, Kabbalah, Neo-Kabbalah, Neo-Hasidism, etc. And so the picture is a lot different from the pie chart that the Israeli Bureau of Statistics uses, the right side pie chart. And as I said, if you just think this is the Israeli, the Jewish identity spectrum in Israel, you're missing a lot. You're just not getting a full picture of what we're talking about. And so if we want to ask, or if we want to understand Israeli society, we need to ask ourselves, how did we get from the right side to the left side? How did Israeli Jewish identity become so divergent, so diverse, so multifaceted? What really happened? And in order to understand what really happened, I think we need to understand this. We need to understand the secular Zionist identity crisis. Something happened in which a certain type of Jewish identity, a secular Zionist Jewish identity, crumbled. It went through a crisis and did not come out on the other side. It just ceased to exist. And the fact that it ceased to exist, this major fluctuation, major happening in Israeli society changed it completely all over. So what really happened? What really happened? And let me just turn the page here. I want to. Yeah. If we are talking about secular Zionist identity or secular Jewish identity, we first need to understand what that is. It didn't mean once Jews who are simply secular, Jews who are non-observant and live in Israel. That's what it means a lot of the time today. But once it was a much larger, much richer, much more robust identity. It was in a specific way of understanding what our Judaism is for these secular Zionist Jews. And let me let me bring you a quote to flesh this out a little bit. This is a quote from Uri Avneri. Avneri is one of the most prominent Israeli journalists, or was for a lot of years. He died, I think, less than 10 years ago. He fought in the Independence War and later founded a newspaper, a magazine in Israel. But that's beside the point. What I want to show is what he says about what he was, what the Jewish secular identity was. And I want to read. At the beginning of the founding of the state, there was talk of the Jewish people in the diaspora, the Jewish religion, the Jewish immigration. There was talk about a Hebrew army, a Hebrew state, a Hebrew government, and even a Hebrew fleet that did not yet exist. Hebrew, speak Hebrew. Hebrew, the first one is a person, right? If you're a Hebrew person, speak Hebrew. The distinction was born naturally in order to distinguish between two entities, the world Jewish diaspora on one side and the new national entity in Israel on the other. So Uri Avneri, and I can bring you a lot more quotes to this effect, talks about a certain distinction and a certain identity that developed in the founding years of Israel and a little before and a little later, and which had a name. The name was the Hebrew. That was a certain Jewish identity that these people took upon themselves. They called themselves Hebrews, right? And they founded the Hebrew University. It's not the Hebrew University because it speaks Hebrew. It's the Hebrew University because it was of Hebrews. They were not Jews. Jews are diasporic creatures, passive, weak, victims. We are something completely different. We are strong. We are proud. We are not religious. We're secular, and we're proudly secular. We're militantly secular. We're socialists, and we are building a model society here in Israel that will reflect our values. I want to bring you another quote, this time from David Ben-Gurion. When Ben-Gurion wants to describe the Jewish soldier in the IDF, how does he call it? What characteristics does he give it, right? This is from 1953. He is healthy in body and spirit, an innovator, brave and able, nimble and industrious, not set back by difficulty, and loyal to the goals of the state and the nation. Okay? This is Ben-Gurion describing the attributes of the IDF soldier, 1953. And I would like to take this and broaden it up to describe the characteristics of this Hebrew identity that was there, right? They are brave, they are intuitive, they are innovative, they are healthy in body and spirit, etc., right? They are not diasporic Jews, and no offense, but this is what these people thought, right? It's a certain type of Jewish identity which had these characteristics and which took upon itself the presumption of being the end all, the really summit of Judaism, of historical Judaism in its entirety. The whole of Jewish history becomes manifested in this identity, in the Jew who is strong, proud, independent, secular, socialist, on their own land, building their own state, and indeed fulfilling the dreams of the generations, but in a secular and socialist way. We are building a model society like the prophets prophesied, right? Taking care of the needy, taking care of the poor, the weak, building an egalitarian society, but of course in a modern secular way. And what I want to suggest is that something happened to this identity. approximately in the 70s and even more so in the 80s, this identity went through a terrible crisis, which at the end simply brought it to its demise. We don't have that identity today. It's not an option today for Jews in Israel to be this. I'm talking generally, but once this was the obvious hegemonic, by the way, identity for secular Jews and even all Jews in Israel, because these people built the state and were the uncontested hegemony for years, right? Until 77, where the right took power for the first time. Today, you don't have that. I want to again to give you to bring a quote about something that happened about this crisis. This quote is from A.B. Joshua, Aleph Bet Yoshua, one of the most famous authors in Hebrew that died, I think, just 2 years ago or even less. And this is from an interview with him at the end of the 80s. It came out in 1990. Okay, and so it's in Joseph Cohen's book Voices of Israel, and Cohen is asking him, what is your view of the situation of writers in Israel today? And Joshua says, a dramatic change is occurring. There used to be a kind of structured Zionist socialist center, and writers wrote comfortably from within its boundaries. They were very much concerned with what we could call the national experience. This center has now collapsed, and we cannot act as if it still exists. In the coming years, we will have to find our way in an Israel that no longer has a center. The center has broken down, and it makes it impossible to present a comprehensively ordered picture of Israeli society. We have to find a new way of expressing the Israeli experience. Now, really, I think Joshua here, in a genius that perhaps is reserved for authors, in a sensitivity that allows him to feel Israeli society as it changes, puts his finger right on the money, right on what's happening, right? And what's happening is that the old center of the Zionist, secular, socialist hegemony has crumbled. And he, as an author, needs to think again, who is he writing about and what is he writing against or for? Because things have changed in Israel. There is no longer that center. And what happens when that center is no longer there is, first of all, that a lot of other voices who were silenced before, basically, or at least in many ways silenced, now can voice themselves. So many Jewish identities who were subdued under this great hegemonic socialist, Zionist, secular hegemony, can now voice themselves and speak up. But another thing happens, and what happens is that a great public, the whole of the secular public in Israel, the whole of the Zionist secular public, suddenly does not have an easy way or a articulated way to answer the question, how am I Jewish? What makes me Jewish? They don't have an answer to that question. Now, some of them, a minority, don't need an answer. They say, well, I don't care. I'm just living my life. I'm in Israel and whatever. But I would say a majority needs some sort of answer, some sort of way to explain to themselves how they are Jewish. And so what happens then? What happens from the 70s, 80s, and on is that the center part of the Israeli public, the secular Jews who founded the state, are beginning to look for new answers to the question, what makes me Jewish? In what way am I Jewish? Right? And they're doing it, I would suggest, in two broad ways. They're doing either they are engaging in what we call and what is called and what we might refer to as the Jewish Renaissance, which is basically secular Jews re-engaging with their tradition, or so, and I will talk about it in detail in a moment, or they are finding a Jewish identity in what we might call Jewish ethno-nationalism. And here I want to say from the start, I don't think ethno-nationalism is a slur word. Okay, it's not a curse. I don't think it's automatically negative. Of course, it can be negative, but I don't think it's automatically negative. I think many states in the world are ethnic nationalities. Japan, Spain, Greece, to take three easy examples. And in Israel also is an ethnic nationality. It's the nationality of the ethnic group, which is the Jews, right? And I would suggest the Jews are an ethnicity, but that's perhaps an argument for another time. I think Masoa will talk a little bit about this tomorrow, and I will talk also about it in sorry, in a week from today. So, and here again, we've got an answer to the question, how am I Jewish? And now I would like to go in detail to both these identities. Okay, first the Jewish Renaissance. So what is the Jewish Renaissance? As I said, approximately since the 90s, we have had Jews re-engaging with their tradition in many different ways. So these are secular Jews who never before were interested so too much in learning, let's say, Bible, Talmud, Kabbalah, different facets of tradition. They're not becoming Orthodox. They're not BT Jews, Balei Tshuva. They're not becoming observant Jews, but they are, dabbling, learning, and taking up different practices concerning Judaism. Now, what does that mean? I want to give you an example. This is from Chensfoni, a lady that is in one of the organizers of a sort of prayer group for secular Jews in Israel. And this is what she says. We wanted to stop talking about the Sabbath and start experiencing it. In Bnei Jeshurun, we saw people like us define as secular that prayer is a natural and authentic part of their life. In the beginning, we didn't say the Shema at all, because how can you say that? Then we placed it in the prayer book, but did not say it out loud. And anybody could choose to say it or not. Today, we read it out loud, and whoever does not want to, does. Okay, so I think this is an amazing text, right? This is an amazing example of Israeli Jews who saw what they call secular Jews in Bnei Jeshurun, so obviously in Manhattan, I would guess. They saw Jews that do not observe the halakha in their life, but they're praying and they're engaging in a ritual. And they said, "What? We didn't know that was an option. Let's take it. Let's take it up. Let's adopt that." And they're doing it, and they're negotiating with the way to pray. Right? Do we say the Shema? Do we not say the Shema? And in the picture you can see how this works. I don't know if you can see it. Let me see. Maybe I have a little marker here. Yeah. You see there are candles here on the. There are candles here on the table, right? Because this is Friday evening. This is Erev Shabbat. They're doing Kabbalat Shabbat. And there's a guitar because they're playing music. It's not Orthodox at all. These are secular people. They're not even, they don't have yarmulkes, etc. So this is what we're talking about in general when we talk about the Jewish Renaissance in Israel. Now, it's not only that. We can divide it broadly into two different broad parts. On the right-hand side, you see the logos of different pluralistic Beit Midrash or pluralistic yeshivas. Oranim, Bina, Elul, Kolot, Alma, which teach Talmud in a secular and pluralistic way. On the left side, you see logos of a few more spiritually inclined groups. Kabbalah La'am, which is a neo-Kabbalah group, just like the Kabbalah Center in Los Angeles. We've got the neo-Hasidic Nachman, Braslav Hasids that are not all Orthodox. We've got in the bottom left corner, Torat Yemima. This is a woman, this Yemima Avital, a woman that taught a new type of Jewish psychology and is very, a movement started around here in Israel. And you got the Shabbat Todah, Kabbalat Shabbat in the port of Tel Aviv. That's the picture you're seeing. Hundreds of people gathering in the port and doing Kabbalat Shabbat in a secular and new way. So, in general, this is the Jewish Renaissance, right? And it even affects, it influences society because, as you can see from this headline from 2019, fewer Israelis marrying through the rabbinate, right? Report shows, and I'll read the subheadline. The Minister of Religious Services attributes the drop to general changes in marriage trends. However, the report is evidence of a growing contempt in Israel toward the rabbinate and the power it wields. So, if you're engaged in tradition in your own way, on your own terms, suddenly you can think, well, maybe I don't want to marry through the chief rabbinate, which has a very generic Orthodox set chuppah ritual, right? Perhaps you want to marry in a way that you have learned yourself, right? I mean, you are anyway learning Talmud in a pluralistic way. You are engaging in Kabbalat Shabbat in a pluralistic way. Why not marry the way that you want? So this is a sort of a privatization of Judaism, a liberalization of Judaism in Israel that influences how people identify as Jews and carry their Jewish lives. The logos you see here on the right bottom corner are three different organizations that offer alternative chuppas, alternative weddings from the chief rabbinate. They are not authorized, or you cannot register the weddings that you perform through these organizations, but perhaps you don't need to be registered in the state as married, and you conduct chuppas, and you do chuppas, through these organizations. I wanted to say that I myself conducted chuppas for the middle one, Havaya, for people who didn't want to marry through the chief rabbinate. So that's the Jewish Renaissance, and now I want to move over to ethno-national Judaism. Jewish identity as an ethno-national identity. And again, not necessarily negative, but what I mean here is it's basically a very simple identity. I am Jewish because I'm part of the Jewish people, and I'm Jewish because my blood is Jewish, and I'm Jewish, and I perform this Judaism by being very patriotic, usually right-wing, very defensive about the Jewish people, and very loud at people who are not patriotic enough in my eyes for the Jewish people, right? That's the basic identity, right? And the picture that you see here, I took it myself in Shuk Machne Yehuda, and the Machne Yehuda market here in Jerusalem. This guy is carrying a humongous flag with the image of the Beit Mikdash, of the temple on it, right? He's wearing a t-shirt with the face of the Mayor Kahana, the Rabbi Kahana on it, Kahana, the extreme racist who was disqualified from running to parliament, to Knesset in the 80s. He's wearing a Golani beret, an army beret of the Golani Brigade, and he's on his shoulder is strapped sort of a ghetto blaster, blasting out the Tikva in rap. Okay, this is the image. Okay, and so as you can see here, what is this guy's Judaism? Right? It's not Orthodox. It's certainly not Reform or conservative, and it's not secular as such. Right? The temple, right? It is, I would say, ethno-nationalist, very using Jewish symbols as a way to express an identity that is very patriotic, even militantly so, etc., nationalistic, obviously, etc. That's what we're talking about. Now, this, of course, does not stay in the market, let's say, in the marketplace. This is another example I want to bring you of it. This is a screenshot of a YouTube of an election ad for Netanyahu, for the Likud. And here Netanyahu is praying. He is praying for the safety of the soldiers of the IDF. it's written there at Chayalei Tzva Haganah Yisrael, please protect the soldiers of the IDF. He's praying and singing with others in a synagogue. Now, I don't know if you know, but Netanyahu is totally secular. He's an atheist. He eats shrimp whenever he can, does not observe any mitzvah at all, and certainly has never actually prayed in a talit, in a synagogue in his life, right? As an authentic observance of the mitzvah. That's not him at all, right? So what we have here again is a recruitment of Jewish symbols, of Jewish traditional symbols towards an underlying and emphasizing of a national identity, of an ethno-national identity, protecting the IDF soldiers, asking God to protect IDF soldiers, right? This is what it is, right? It's not religion at all. It's a new type of identity, or of a way for Jews in Israel, especially secular Jews, to explain to themselves how they are Jewish. Now, here I even brought a cover of the Mishpacha Ultra-Orthodox magazine that, as you can see, hosts a Patriot missile system in its center, and the cover article talks about women, Haredi women, working with the IDF. They're not soldiers, they are civilians working with the IDF for pay, operating this missile system. And the Mishpacha Ultra-Orthodox magazine celebrates that. So even the Haredi public, in its large, in its periphery that is growing larger, is becoming this sort of nationalistic public, right? Again, celebrating women working with the army, Haredi women. That's what we see here. So this is what we have. We have on the one side this privatized, tailor-made Jewish identity of the Jewish Renaissance, the Jews engaging with tradition on their own terms. And on the other hand, a huge chunk of ethno-nationalist Jewish identity. And I would say that from the 80s and certainly the 90s on, Israel has split into basically these very two large groups. Within them are, of course, many other divergent groups, but these are the two great directions that Israeli society has headed towards, right? And what I would now, these are a few more examples that I will skip with your permission. What I would now like to talk about is how these two great trends align themselves with the judicial overhaul. And for that, I want to present three prisms through which we can see the current crisis, struggle with the judicial overhaul in Israel. So the first and smallest prism which we can see the judicial overhaul from is talking about the judicial system in Israel. Perhaps the Supreme Court has taken too much power for itself. The government or the parliament wants to correct that. Perhaps the government wants to change the way the system works, and there's an argument about it, okay? This is the very basic and smallest prism through which we can see this. Another prism, right? Another prism, and here the great, the protests and the resistance movement come in. Another prism is a struggle between two major groups in Israeli society. And here, this prism is, of course, the prism that these two groups that I was talking about clash. On the one hand, we've got a group which is more secular and more liberal. Liberal here, not in the American sense as progressive. They are also more progressive, but they are also simply more liberal. Liberal in the way that they are centered more on the individual rights discourse, autonomy, equality before the law, the rule of law, and norms of good governance, etc. So on one side, these are the people that are struggling against the judicial overhaul. And again, you can see that this is the more privatized Judaism sort of public. And on the other hand, on the other side, we've got the more ethno-nationalist sort of public that is less progressive, obviously, more traditional, more orthodox, more observant, more conservative, certainly, and that wants to emphasize in Israel qualities that are not voluntary as the basis of the governance system and of society itself. Qualities such as the Jewish people, Jewish blood, Jewish soil, Jewish tradition, qualities that you are born into and do not choose. And for them, these qualities are more important than judicial obstructions, than bureaucratic formalities about how the Supreme Court should work or not, etc. And here, these are the two groups that are clashing in Israel here. And I will say a bit more later about this. And the third and largest prism through which we can see the judicial overhaul in Israel is the global context, because we know that this sort of struggle, this sort of argument, polemic, is not limited to Israel, of course, right? You have it also in the United States, certainly in Europe, in countries like Hungary and Poland and France and Italy, where the populist right is either got in power or gaining power. And we've got it in India, we've got it in Turkey. Russia is certainly long past any argument about this. This is a global phenomenon. And here I will not get into it, but I would say it's the crisis of the liberal order and the rise of populism as a global phenomenon. And of course, here, the two groups fit in, one more populist and one more liberal. Again, liberal not in the progressive sense, but in the very classic sense. Okay? So, the quest for a relevant Jewish identity that began in the 90s and formed these two major groups, one more privatized, more liberal, more individualistic, more progressive, one more traditional, more communal, more observant, more orthodox, and more ethno-national, right? And within them, of course, many more different and diverse groups. These two groups are now clashing over the judicial overhaul. And if we take this extreme zoom out and watch what's happening in Israel, we can see that since the 70s, or certainly the 80s, these two groups have been building up their power and their self-image and identity as if in order to clash this at this time when the world all over is going through a crisis of liberalism. And this is what's happening right now in Israel, this great clash of these two groups, and we're really in the middle of it, but I will of course address it if you want, and let's then open for questions at this time. Right, Ari?
Perfect. Would you unshare the screen and I'll open the chat real quick here. Already have a bunch of questions, as you can imagine.
Wait. There we go. Okay.
I'm just opening the chat, so hold on. So please feel free to check them. Oops.
If not, I
yeah, I have. So let me start with one fundamental question, because maybe I missed it. You talked about the breakdown of the center, of the secular Zionist center, this vision of Israel, and you referenced maybe the 60s or 70s. But I don't know if you explained why it broke down.
Right, I did. So let me explain quickly. I would say a few different reasons came and converged to basically shatter the secular socialist Zionist Jewish identity. One was social, in which there was a great disappointment with the leadership, with the hegemonic leadership after the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War of 73 was a great crisis of faith in the leadership, which failed Israel. And so different social structures began shifting. And in 77, we have the rise of the right to power for the first time, and really basically ever since they were in power. That's on that side. But even broader than that, Israel simply ceased to be a socialist state from the 80s on. Socialism died basically all over the world. The Soviet bloc crumbled or began crumbling. And Israel began a process of privatization and globalization. And this process changed not only Israel's economy, but Israel's society. Privatization is never limited only to the economy. Israelis became more individualistic, more self-centered, and the whole understanding of society as this, we're together working for building a model society, etc., one for all, basically ceased to exist. And as that ceased to exist, also that identity that I talked about earlier, that pioneers, Hebrew, healthy, innovative, militant, secular person disappeared. And so that's what happened, basically.
So thank you. Another question was, when you talked about what's happening now, and you said your argument is that this collapse of the center led to the two groups, the Jewish Renaissance and the Jewish Ethno-Nationalists. But I don't know if it's anecdotal, but I've spoken to many people who are in the rallies, in these protests, and they say it's not just secular people, but who are on one side versus ethno-nationalists. That you actually have religious people who are in the different camps, and so it's not as simple as that, right?
So you have religious people in the liberal
protest.
Camp, let's call it in general terms. Of course, I'm not saying all the others aren't liberal, but in general. But they are a very small minority. Really, honestly saying, most of the great block of people who go to the street and protest and organize for protests in the resistance to the current government are either secular Jews or descendants of secular Jews, right? And that's the world. I'm not saying necessarily that they are left-wing. Perhaps this should be stressed. It's not only the left wing. There's not a lot of left wing in Israel politically, right? These are many centrist people. These are many people that have served years in the IDF or our secret service, the Mossad and the Shabak. These are very, certainly not extreme left, and I would even say not very left wing, but they are something else than this government. And I would definitely characterize them as more secular than the government.
There was a good point about the collapse of the kibbutz movement, which I assume fits into what you were saying about that time period.
In the 80s, kibbutzim becoming privatized. Right?
There are a few questions about how the Sephardim and the Mizrahim fit within this contemporary model you were presenting.
So I'll just say a few words, and if you want to elaborate, we can. Obviously, there are more Mizrahim in the side of the government, the current government, and more Ashkenazim in the side of the protests. Why? As we said in the beginning, the Mizrahim from inception were more traditional. And it's traditional here not only in the way that they practiced religion, but in the way that they were more rooted or situated in their ethnicity, in their Jewishness was more ethnic, because coming from a minority ethnic groups in Muslim countries who did not go through emancipation, they did not become citizens as Jews in France or Germany or Britain or the United States, of course, became, they could not become modern individuals as these groups could, right? It's a different way of practicing your Judaism. You're still in the ghetto, as it were, right? And so And so what we see here, what we see today is that this sort of Jewish identity goes more into what we call the ethno-national camp.
And does that also tie in with the Russian immigrants as well then?
No, the Russian immigrants is a different thing. So here's a good example. Most Russian immigrants are certainly right-wing, but the people who came from Russia are mostly secular and even very devoutly secular. Okay, the pork market in Israel boomed in the 90s with the immigration from the Soviet Union because these people, that's what they are used to eat, and there's a market for it. They don't like what the current government is doing because one of the projects of the current government is you can call it the Orthodoxization of the Israeli public sphere, the halachization, you can say, of the public sphere. They don't want more religious coercion. They certainly don't want more people questioning their own Judaism coming from the Soviet Union, always requesting papers of their grandmothers that, prove that they're Jewish, etc. So they are on the side, most of them are on the side of the protests.
Well, that's why it's getting complicated, because wouldn't you think that the Russians would be ethno-nationalists then, based on their backgrounds? And
so again, these are very broad ways of understanding them, very broad categories, but I would say, but again, for them, secularization or secularity of the public sphere and less power to the chief rabbinate of Israel are very important principles. And I would say that pushes them more to the side of the protests.
I didn't recall in your chart where you talked about settlers and how that fits into this model, because there are different types of settlers as well, right?
Yeah, this talks to the second prism that I was talking about, not the actual judicial argument between people who want more power to the Supreme Court, less power to the Supreme Court. Here we have the ulterior motives of different groups in the current government for this judicial overhaul. Netanyahu, of course, has his trial, right? He needs to get out of jail, right? He needs a get out of jail card. Basically, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but that I think it's very clear that that's his issue. But other groups have much larger projects. The Haredi group, the Ultra-Orthodox, want a release from any army service in law, right? They don't want to be enlisted into the army ever. They want I forgot the word in English, again, a release, a sort of a
exemption.
Exemption, thank you. An exemption from studies in governmentally funded schools that are anything but Torah, so English, math, etc. out. And so that's what they need the judicial overhaul for. They won't want the Supreme Court to disqualify, to annul the laws that permit them to do that. And then we've got the settlers. And here, the religious Zionism in government is perhaps the most extreme party to ever represent religious Zionism in an Israeli government. They are Hardan, they are Haredi religious Zionists. And yes, what they want is the Supreme Court to butt out of whatever is happening in Judea and Samaria, in the occupied territories. They don't want the Supreme Court to tell them that they need to evacuate some an outpost, illegal outpost that they built. They don't want the Supreme Court certainly to say that the Palestinians have a minimum right to this or that. And perhaps one day they will want to annex the whole of Judea and Samaria, and then they will not want to give citizenship to the 2-3 million Palestinians over there. So that's what they need the judicial overhaul for.
So before we end, a few quick questions, but one of them is, given what you've explained to us over the last hour, how do you explain the results of the recent election that empowered this unusual coalition that's led to the situation that we're seeing play out in Israel?
So first of all, to be honest, there are many people, perhaps a small majority, who wanted this government. I don't think they want the judicial overhaul. Every survey for the last few months says that most Israelis don't want it. Every survey. But they did want this government. But then again, it's important to understand, it's important to know that this government came into power on a very slim margin, a few tens of thousands of citizens. For different reasons, the left was not organized, or the opposition was not organized enough. A whole party did not reach the threshold of legitimate number of votes to get into parliament. So the left lost a huge amount of votes through that mishap, and other different little things. And again, this government has 64 out of 120 seats in parliament, but won in a much, much slimmer majority.
So I just want to end this part one. It's been a great part one, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We got 3 more parts in the series and another follow-up or related program on Sunday. You were at Berkeley for a few years, and I'm just wondering if you could just share with what was it like for you teaching Israel studies in Berkeley of all places? I'm taking it to a little different area to learn more about.
I was warned a lot about Berkeley, etc., but I myself did not experience any hostility or animosity at all on campus, and I even came to campus with my yarmulke, and no problem at all. But at times, my students did receive, they were shouted at because simply for being Jews, thought to be Zionists, even if some of them are, right? So these phenomena actually exist, right? This sort of a automatic disqualification of students on campus, of Jewish students on campus, because they are presumed to be supporting Israel. It does exist. Again, I myself did not experience it.
We're going to learn more about you, Tomer, over the next few classes and your background, and I'll obviously focus on our topic. We're a little bit out of time today, so I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank everybody for their great input. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody's input. Rachel Jacobson, it's nice to have you with us. And I'll give you Tomer's email so you can email him directly.
Oh yeah, please.
And we'll do follow-up like we usually do. We recorded this program so you can watch it again. A lot of stuff going on here. And thank you for your perspective on this, Tomer. And I love the charts. I like seeing things. I'm a visual learner. So I appreciate it. It's good to have you all with us today. And we'll see you back.
Thank you. Looking forward.
Sunday, hopefully, and lots of programs coming up. Thank you for supporting CSP, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.